At the time of making this, Kingdom Hearts 1 is my favorite game in the Kingdom Hearts series. Lately I've learned that the game is not held in as much of a positive light as I thought it was. A lot of people think it hasn't aged well. I think some things have aged too. The camera is sometimes obnoxious. Being unable to open chests while in combat is tedious. Gummy ship missions are boring. Sometimes the game may give you no directions, and some of the boss fights are just not any fun. While it's aged in some respects, I still think the combat really holds up. It's a simple action RPG. Defend, retaliate, and use magic. For the most part, I view 2 as an extension of 1. Sora feels similar to Control, but he's faster and has new movement abilities. The camera's nice and zoomed out, and it rarely hinders you. And while there are some bosses I would consider bad, they aren't the infuriating type of bad. They're just boring. The game also remixes some of your old options in combat while giving you a lot of new ones. KH2 plays significantly better than the first one, and there's no denying that. Despite this, the first one is still my favorite one, because it has a lot of experimental and raw ideas that I really like. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the differences between 1 and 2, and why I prefer 1 so much. So let's get started with... You might be wondering how I could possibly prefer the story in KH1 to KH2, and for good reason. 1 story is okay, while 2 is a step up in almost every single way. In the first game, Sora is a really simple protagonist. I never strongly identified with him because he was just a happy boy who always did the right thing. He even wanted to save his friend Riku despite his evil actions. I think the game shines in particular when it comes to his rivalry with Riku. The game also gets you in on it by having Riku beat your ass senseless on Destiny Islands. I'm sure I can't be the only one who named the boat Riku Sucks Dicks after finally beating him in a race. Anyway, after Destiny Island falls to darkness, these 2 characters get set on different paths. One is guided by their friends, and one is manipulated by Disney villains. The villains are acting together as a force to end all the worlds. This entire premise is very simple, if not cliché, but it's very entertaining, and that's key to me, being entertained all the way through. None of the Disney worlds felt like filler. Every world you visit feels like it's part of a greater story. I had to ensure every single world was safe and seal the keyholes so they wouldn't fall to darkness like Sora's home island. Every keyhole sealed was a victory against the villain's master plan to flood all the worlds with darkness. And beyond that, we still suffered some losses when Alice and Jasmine got kidnapped. Finding them and returning them to their homes becomes a part of your journey now. If you don't save some of the worlds, the game incorporates that into its gameplay. When you make it to the end of the world, you'll be forced to fight in some of the worlds you didn't save because you abandoned them. I don't feel a lot of strong emotions playing through Kingdom Hearts because it's a very staple hero saves the day type of story, but the ending does get me a little emotional. Once you complete your quest and save the universe from the darkness, you lose the friends you were searching for the whole game. It's simple in execution, but it really gets you to feel things a little bit for your character, and that's pretty much the height of KH1. Now let's compare it to KH2. In KH2, Sora is much more emotionally mature. His only trait isn't just being optimistic anymore. He gets sad, frustrated, and he's really witty. He's a fun character and way more relatable than he was in the first game. But you don't start off as Sora in this game, you start off as his nobody, Roxas. In the short time you play as Roxas, I got really attached to him. All he's trying to do is live out his last few days of summer vacation with his friends. And as all these weird events start surrounding Roxas, there's a bit of anxiety in the air. What's happening to Roxas, and what happens when summer vacation ends? In the end, when you say goodbye to summer, you also have to say goodbye to Roxas. It turns out the life he was living was a lie, and he's part of Sora's soul and he has to return. This new character whose life you just lived out has to disappear to get your old one back. Right from the start, KH2 is more emotionally engaging and develops more characters than KH1 ever did. But here's my problem. After the intro, the game sways from engaging to unengaging. This time Sora's goal is to look for his friends once again and put a stop to the mysterious Organization 13 whose goals are unknown. And with the organization being new original characters comes new worlds. The World That Never Was, Twilight Town, and Hollow Bastion all contain original stories and characters. These worlds never failed to entertain and surpass KH1 in quality. But when I'm in a Disney world, I tend to lose interest. For the most part, Disney worlds are strict on following the stories from the movies, essentially making them mediocre retellings, with Sora and the Heartless kinda photoshopped in there. It doesn't feel like my presence in these worlds is important to the overall plot. It's put best when Belle asks Sora if they're there because something strange is going on, and Sora just goes, I don't know. We're just kinda wandering from place to place. Pete shows up in most of the Disney worlds, replacing Maleficent by teaming up with the Disney villains. But unlike KH1, it doesn't feel like there's any sort of master plan. Pete doesn't feel like he's there for any particular reason besides to be a bad guy and supply the Disney villains with the Heartless for their movies. His time travel plot was cool, but once you go through all the worlds once, Pete just disappears and becomes irrelevant. It's understandable because at this point it's revealed that killing the Heartless with the Keyblade is what the organization wants. Pete is on Team Maleficent, and they don't want to give in to the organization's plans, so he probably doesn't want to spread Heartless anymore. Makes sense. But it doesn't change how boring Pete is and how he just awkwardly shows up at the finale to do nothing one last time. Moving on from Pete, the worlds that I take the most issue with are Aladdin, Halloween Town, Pirates of the Caribbean, and The Lion King. When I play through these worlds, it feels like the cutscenes are so long and there's such a slog to go through. 3 of these worlds are strictly retelling their movie, with bad pacing between gameplay and cutscenes. I feel like I should also include The Little Mermaid in this too. Sure, the world is just minigames and cutscenes, but so is the 100 Acre Woods, and I motherfucking love the 100 Acre Woods. It's a really comfy world, and Sora's interactions with the characters is really sweet and entertaining. I don't think The Little Mermaid had to be as boring as it was. On the second visit to most of the worlds, you don't have to follow the movie threads anymore. And this is a good thing, because the interactions with Disney characters outside of the movie are less forced and they're more fun.
Oh, it's you guys. Man, we were hoping you were a meal.
Hiya. Don't give me any of that hiya stuff.
Maybe someday Jack will be able to use the Keyblade after all.
Why's that?
He and Sora are kind of alike, don't you think?
Or not.
Holly!
Excuse me?
Barley?
This is what I find really charming, and I wish the worlds were more like that to begin with. Hercules and Tron were my favorite worlds, and maybe that's because I haven't seen their movies. The Tron world was much more involved in the plot, and Tron was actually a pretty cool character. In Olympus, half of the plot is shared with a Final Fantasy character, which makes it a bit more interesting. So it's not like the Disney worlds have no potential at all. Despite Kingdom Hearts 2 having better written characters and overall plot, the pacing of the game is what kills it for me. It's what makes it harder for me to play through compared to KH1. When I go through 1, I actually enjoy watching all the cutscenes. I'm consistently entertained throughout my whole adventure, and that pulls me forward. In most RPGs, I need a good mix of story and gameplay in order to keep myself from burning out, regardless if I've already beaten the game or not. So I'll always prefer KH1's story because it manages to hold my interest throughout the whole game. There are 3 things I think of when it comes to KH1's level design: charming, interactive, and explorative. I can understand why many people aren't fond of KH1's level design when a level like Tarzan exists. It's really a cryptic level. The game doesn't tell you where to go or give you any hints. You just run around in circles like a monkey till you stumble upon the next part of the story. And don't forget Tarzan's cousin, Monstro, which has its own problems. The maze itself is fine, but the music and the aesthetic is so boring. The real problem is there's a bunch of flying enemies and a lot of tiny platforms. This doesn't give you a lot of room to swing your Keyblade around because if you do, you'll end up falling down and having to go through a lot of the maze again. You might also platform your way to a chest, only for a flying enemy to spawn and then fly off way into the distance, making it so you're unable to open the chest and you have to go chase it down. It's just really tedious. Not a single level in KH2 is bad like these stages are. KH1's levels have low lows, but they also have high highs. Traverse Town, Hollow Bastion, Aladdin, Alice in Wonderland, and Atlantica. These levels have neat interconnected segments, a good amount of platforming, and tons of nooks and crannies with secrets begging to be explored. In KH2, most levels are relatively flat and linear with no branching sections to explore. 2 has faster movement and more movement options, but you don't have anywhere interesting to use them for platforming outside of a short segment in the Cavern of Remembrance. With the exception of Twilight Town, KH2's level design doesn't really facilitate exploration. It's almost impossible to miss any good rewards, like summons, gear, attack, defense stat-ups, and torn pages, because chests are laid out on your path and are hard to miss. The most exploration you do is going back to find the puzzle pieces, once you get all the movement abilities to reach them. None of the rewards from the puzzle pieces felt gratifying to get except for the grand ribbon. The pieces felt like a checklist, it didn't feel like I was searching to find any exciting items. In KH1 you might get crafting materials or gummy pieces you don't care about, but there are a good amount of immediate rewards that make chests a bit more exciting. You get strong healing items, all kinds of stat ups, a summon. You can even get a decent Keyblade if you remember to turn to Wonderland in the late game. Chests also give you some of the 101 Dalmatians or the torn pages for the 100 Acre Woods, which end up giving you different rewards such as magics or summons. I like that there's always something optional to explore, and that a playthrough will be completely different from my friends depending on what they decided to do. I might be stronger because I found more stat ups. Maybe they'll have an easier time with some of the harder bosses because they found better healing items. Or maybe they have stronger gear and magic. Optional content being significant to your playthrough is good, and it's a feeling that KH2 is missing. The worlds in 1 are also very interactive. In Traverse Town there are tons of little secrets you can find by interacting with things. Here's one I never knew of till recently. In the hotel lobby it'll tell you there's an art exhibit. Check out the paintings and then talk to the clerk again and he'll tell you to strike the clock in the green room. Do this and you get a chest. Finding and discovering secrets like this on your own is addictive, and it's not the only world that does things like this. In Olympus Coliseum, when you come back with a stronger blizzard spell, you can put out the fires. In Tarzan, you can manually craft a potion if you read the instructions. In Halloween Town, knock on the door like a trick-or-treater and you get an item. In Hollow Bastion, you can either jump into these water bubbles or freeze them to make a platform. You can also use gravity to lower some chests. This is all really basic, but interaction makes the world more fun to explore. Finally, when it comes to charm, levels in KH1 try to bring their charm from the Disney World itself. Tarzan has you sliding down vines and shit. Alice in Wonderland has you changing sizes to solve short puzzles. You can also do some bizarre things in the Bazaar Room. You go through Olympus's plot by fighting in the tournaments. Discover treasures in the Cave of Wonders and then make out like thieves in an escape sequence. And Atlantica is a whole level that takes place under the sea. I know most people aren't a fan of gameplay changes that take away your abilities and options, and I can understand why. I've been on the other side. But I'm one of the few people who are really charmed by Atlantica. It changes the way you approach and explore the world. In 2, the Lion King world is pretty similar to this. Speaking of KH2, outside of the Lion King, it doesn't feel like the worlds have the same charm to them. And that's not a bad thing, it's just preference because KH2 tries to be charming in a different way, and that's through the combat. Heartless are more tailored to the worlds they're in than they were before. Disney party members have flashy limit attacks with Sora. There's a lot of gimmicks in combat, like pirates being immune in Pirates of the Caribbean unless they're standing in moonlight, or Mulan having a morale meter you need to keep up. There's also light cycle racing in Tron. The carpet ride from KH1 is back, except it's combat focused now. On top of all this, the worlds look beautiful and you get a themed menu for each one. The aesthetic is really clean. Both games have a lot of charm in their own unique ways, but I prefer KH1's charm for capturing the magic of Disney worlds. I've already gone over how 2's combat is so much more superior. Despite this, I still have reasons combat-wise to prefer 1 over 2. The biggest one is because I have a preference to defense over offense, and KH1 is the more defensive game. The early tutorial fights in Destiny Island teach you to analyze your enemy, and that if you time your attacks, you can parry the enemy, create an opening, and gain EXP. Since the speed of KH1 is so much slower, parrying feels easy to do and even essential to the combat. I love that I have to take the time to understand each enemy's movements and what moves they can do in order for me to respond accordingly with defensive maneuvers. Besides from a few standouts in KH2, I don't know what a lot of the enemies can do to me or what the timing for their attacks are. I know generally when some reaction commands are going to pop up, so if I need to be defensive, I'll either mash triangle, let a summon handle it, or I'll use reflect when an enemy flinches, which usually works out. Don't get me wrong, in the context of what you can do in KH2, those things aren't a negative. In terms of enemy design, I don't consider any enemies in 2 badly designed. In 1, there are 4 enemies that are straight up bad. Dark Balls because they can attack instantly and one of their attacks is hard to see. Then there are Wizards, Invisibles, and Angel Stars because they can become invincible when they feel like it. To top it off, Wizards and Angel Pots can fly and are immune to most magic, making them more tedious. In 2, there's an enemy that's immune to all magic, but you can close in on enemies really fast, making it a non-issue. With these glaring issues, how could I possibly prefer enemies in 1? Honestly, it's because they're more memorable. I know how all of them work on an individual level, and that makes the fight feel more thoughtful while giving me a sense of mastery. In 2, so many enemies just become fodder. I recently replayed 2 for the first time in 7 years on Critical. I remembered a lot of the early and more challenging Heartless, but there were so many Heartless where I thought, hey, were these guys in the game before? There are just too many Heartless that I mow down without a thought before they get a chance to do anything, and the more combat feels thoughtless, the more I zone out. I have a similar feeling for some of the bosses in 2. One of 2's greatest strengths is how powerful Sora is and how many options you have in combat, allowing you to express yourself however you want. It's also complemented by some well-designed bosses to test your skills against. The organization fights are really well designed and some of the best fights in the series. Those fights are really memorable because of the challenge they posed and how you overcame it. Most of the other bosses in the game are memorable because of their reaction commands. Outside of a few standouts, I can't remember what made most bosses a challenging and special encounter. The reason I love bosses in 1 so much is because it's so experimental. They throw you into weird situations and almost everyone feels different to approach. Boss arenas can vary from circles to an entire house filled with platforming. It's all tied into how KH1 naturally plays. Despite bosses having limited movesets, they took advantage of the environments to make them more interesting. KH1 champions simplicity, but it tries just about every idea that it can. The execution range of these ideas can go from above average to terrible, but I love it nonetheless. I also have a problem with 2 that I never had with 1 that bothers me a lot. If I wanted to use summons or magic in KH1, it was always a deliberate choice, or because the situation called for it. In KH2, for most of the game, I feel forced into using some options that I don't necessarily want to use. I hate grinding but wanted good movement abilities to use throughout my playthrough, so I felt constantly pressured to be in a drive form while playing. The problem is that both summons and drive forms use up the drive gauge, so you can only pick one of those to use. Even if I wanted to use a summon, I would use a drive form instead, even if it meant the encounter would be a bit more tedious. There's exactly one situation where I picked the summon over the drive forms because it significantly trivialized the boss. This even came into odds with other drive forms. Once I unlocked Master and Limit form, I never wanted to touch Valor or Wisdom again because of how weak they felt in comparison. But I still ended up using them so I can minimize the amount of grinding I had to do later. When it comes to MP in KH2, you have choices on how to use the resource too. You can either start recharging your MP with a cure, or a limit, or even an attack spell. But that choice never bothers me because I'm not accumulating anything by choosing one over the other. There's no pressure outside of combat that dictates how I use my MP. It's not fair of me to compare 2 to 1 for not balancing a feature the latter didn't have. But I'm trying to understand why I have this preference for 1, and I found that the way drive forms are implemented, it puts a pressure on me that KH1 just doesn't have. That pressure is always looming over me until all the drive forms are maxed. I could use them less, but it means I would have to grind more. But grinding leads me to burnout, especially when the fastest way is something that's really boring. KH3 is shaping up to have a lot of the things from KH1 that made it so special to me, especially a more interactive and charming world design. The Disney worlds also seem to be more involved in the original plot, and I'm excited because the dialogue between characters will be better than it ever was. While the combat still isn't the slow defensive type I like, it still looks really fun just like KH2 was. But drive forms are gone, so God bless you, Kingdom Hearts 3. It looks like you will end up being my favorite one in this series. I would still love to see another series that was focused on simple platforming and defensive play like KH1 was. I think the old hybrid style of KH1 still has a lot of potential. KH1 is just so raw in its action and RPG elements, and it's really fun. And despite it not being well liked, it will always have a special place in my heart. Even if you can't agree with anything that was said in this video, I hope it gives you a little bit of an understanding on why some people may have such a huge appreciation for KH1, even if 2 is the better game. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment. I love talking about this stuff, and that's it. Thank you for listening.